morning, everybody. Welcome to our session today on what is a socioeconomic paradigm in Europe. What is the effect of the economic policies of Europe on the social structure of the countries concise of Europe? We have with us three distinguished guests who will put us into their minds and the way that they analyze these effects. Mr. Constantinos Petrides, former Minister of Finance of the Republic of Cyprus. Professor Dr. Jean-Louis de Brouwer, Director of the European Affairs Programme, Egmont Institute, and Mr. Charis Polycarpou, Head of Economic Policy Department of AKEL. Welcome. Welcome, everybody. I would give the floor, without further ado, to Mr. Constantinos Petrides, who will put us into his thoughts.
So good morning to you all, fellow Europeans. When I was a student, it was a time that back in the 80s, 90s, it was a time when Cyprus was trying to join the European Union, Cyprus was a small country with its own problems, divided. But a country full of hope that entering the European Union would bring prosperity, would belong for modernization reasons to a bigger family, would bring stability, because as you know, we are at a very dangerous part of the world. It was at the time that the political movement that I was coming from, which was the Christian Democratic Party at the time, in which I was active, it was in the forefront of this effort. At the time when the left in Cyprus was fiercely fighting against our prospect of joining the European Union. So I am a believer in the European Union. It was out of conviction that I studied the EU academically in both my degrees. It was out of conviction that I applied to be one of the first functionaries at the European Commission, and I was for many years before I came back to Cyprus. I joined the European Commission with a wave of enlargement back in 2005. Then I've experienced the European Union from 4 different formations at the level of Council of Ministers. I was a minister for 10 years in 3 different posts. I also attended with the President of the European Council. I was a negotiator with Troika when things were happening during the economic crisis in Cyprus. So I'm not talking as an observer. I'm talking as somebody who has lived the European Union and as a believer to Europe. And I'm not going to count the numerous benefits that Europe brought to its people, that Europe brought to Cyprus. I think many people referred to that. I'm going to talk a little bit critically about the current state of the Union. And I like this title. It's a very general, broad title, the socioeconomic paradigm, that allows us to address what we think the fundamental issues of the European Union is. But we have to start from the beginning. The European Union project was not a bureaucratic project. It was the beliefs and the vision of the Christian Democrats, of Schuman, Adenauer, de Gasperi at the time. They had lived the worst of totalitarianism, of fascism, and they wanted a free Europe. A free Europe, and their answer to that was not either state control or state paternalism. They despised that. They believed in the free markets. They believed in classical liberal economics. They believed in Christian ethics, dignity, solidarity, and responsibility. They also believed in individual freedom and economic interdependency to bring peace. That was the original socioeconomic paradigm. A community of nations bound by law, markets, and values, and common use of natural resources. But I think somewhere on the way, we drifted. In the realm of integration, Europe became centralized, then more centralized, then over-centralized. A system that regulates, supervises, and intervenes in almost every aspect of life. Rules and directives multiplying at every level, often written with the best of intentions, but with very, very little result and out of proportion. Transfer of national competences away from member states and towards central institutions that are not always democratically accountable. Some of these transfers make sense. Trade policy, competition, cross-border environmental standards, issues that no country can manage alone, but others don't. The EU body of law, the AKEL community, counts for more than 100,000 legislative acts, and thousands more come year by year, touching almost every aspect of our life. There are some absurd ones. I'm not going to go through them. But these rules and regulations are not born out of democratic procedures or out of the demand of the people. They are imposed from a top-down approach, coming from the European Commission. Oops, somebody's barking here. I have that when I talk sometimes. Yeah. Coming from the European Commission, which is an unelected bureaucracy, which with the sole right of initiative to propose legislation. And then it goes through a very complex and opaque decision-making process that nobody understands. Far from the citizens' eyes. No wonder people feel alienated. No wonder they believe that democratic deficit exists at the European Union. For some, this is not integration. For some, this is inclusion. And in my eyes, the European Union today, it's much more centralized in many ways than the US, which is a single federation. When it comes to many regulation issues, when it comes to taxation, there is tax competition in the US that doesn't exist in Europe. And we're talking about tax harmonization. So people no longer recognize their voice in the decisions. I think this violates a fundamental principle lying in the heart of the original European socioeconomic paradigm, which is the principle of subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity that all the decisions should be taken as closely as possible to the citizen, and the EU should only intervene in limited affairs when it's needed for cross-border issues. So yes, I think we should bring subsidiarity again. We should add value. We should safeguard our external borders, defense, that nothing is going on at the European Union right now, and the four basic freedoms. Because democracy cannot operate in a fog. And I'm afraid this is what is happening now. And this is why there is reaction. So my view is govern less and govern better. And at the same time, there is another distortion. The same thing that over-centralizes governance also holds back our economy. I remember back in 1995 when I was studying in England, one of the pioneers, of course, at the time, which was the European economy. We had a whole module about Agenda 2000. I don't know if you remember it. Agenda 2000 was the grand plan of the European Commission of how, by the year 2000, the EU should become the most competitive, dynamic, and innovative economy in the world. That was a grand plan. Did it happen? No. Because instead of unleashing enterprise, Europe doubled regulation, subsidies, and state direction. The result was predictable if you believe in classical economics like the founding fathers did. Slower growth, falling competitiveness, and widening the gap with the US and other parts of the world. There is a saying, and unfortunately, it's a diagnosis. The US innovates, China copies, and Europe regulates. The result, innovation slows, investment flees, and we end up importing the very technologies that we could have invented ourselves. This is a state paternalism out of proportion that I think it's very alien to the original socioeconomic paradigm of the European Union. Very recently, the big pharmaceutical companies based in Europe or who remain in Europe threatened that they would leave. And they didn't threaten that they would leave because of the tariffs of Trump. They threatened that they would leave because of heavy regulation and because of heavy taxation. At the same time, our internal market, which was in the original paradigm of the European Union, in the heart, in the core of our beliefs, remains fragmented. Digital services, financial products, even basic professional qualifications face national barriers, while regulation distorts even more. Over and above these distortions, we have now the green agenda, becoming another layer of economic self-harm that would definitely erode further Europe's competitiveness in a in a world that does not follow its lead. Just the estimate is that it would cost 400 billion euros to the European taxpayer, besides the economic distortions. Only in Cyprus, Mr. Theophanous, the cost of the Green Deal would have been 2 to 3 billion. We went bankrupt in 2030 for the same amount of money. I gave a big fight with my colleague ministers to safeguard certain exemptions, because our shipping, which is a big part of our industry, and tourism would have been totally destroyed had we remained faithful to what the bureaucrats dictated as a Green Deal. I could say a lot about that. I'm not going to say a lot. I'm going to try to balance. We have one of the heaviest taxation, unproductive, heaviest taxation in the European Union. This is not capitalism. This is socialism by absorption. And the third imbalance is social, I would say. At some point, Europe began to confuse protection with dependency. We built welfare systems that they were meant to empower citizens, yet too often they ended up creating dependency on the state. Social justice cannot come from endless benefits and payouts. It must come from opportunity, responsibility, and fairness, from giving people the means to stand up on their own feet, not incentives to rely permanently on public support. At the same time, the European idea of the past decades of multicultural societies has drifted into something quite different, a loss of identity. The harsh truth is that the integration of a large part of the uncontrolled and undocumented migration has failed. Now you have enough evidence for that. And I don't think that the fathers before the European Union and our grandparents had so many millions dead to protect Europe just to open its borders, or to have countless genders counted to teach to our children. This creates a reaction, and the reaction can be seen in the polls, and social unrest. People are not running away from the European values, they are reacting to Europe's failures. Migration policy, I did mention before. It's a field where good intentions replaced sound governance. For years, in the name of human rights, Europe opened its doors without having the means to control them. The Dublin and Dublin II regulations were decided behind closed doors for the most important aspect of people's lives. Behind closed doors. Small countries that reacted were not heard, and they were the ones who took all the burden. As a minister, also of internal affairs before, trying to work with the European regulations on migration is impossible. It's impossible to prevent somebody from coming in, and it's almost impossible to deport somebody who is illegally in. I could go a lot, but I'm not, because they are finishing now. But this lies in the heart of the social contract, that the citizens should feel safe. The citizens should feel safe in their home. They should feel safe vis-a-vis external enemies. And today, many Europeans do not feel secure. As Maslow taught in the hierarchy of needs, safety comes immediately after basic survival. It is the foundation upon which all other aspirations, freedom, prosperity, culture depend. And what did we do for security, both home and vis-a-vis the external enemies like Russia and others who threaten the EU? We just discovered we are naked. But the essence of the existence of the state or a union or a federation starts from the basics, providing security, which comes after survival, and then all the rest. We decided to go all the way around, leaving ourselves uncovered. So I'm just finishing. You could talk a lot about these things. What I believe is that Europe has to survive and wants to survive, but it has to regain the trust of its citizens. And the imbalances, I focused in three imbalances: governance, economy, and society. This is creating reaction. And the reaction itself is a bomb into the foundations of the European Union right now. So the answer, I think, to the question about the social paradigm of the EU, of the Europe, is that for me, it's very simple. The Europe should remember why it began. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Petrides, for your insightful analysis. Well appreciated. And now I give the floor to Professor Jean-Louis de Brouwer, who would give us his own analysis of how he sees this paradigm.
Well, it's going to be quite of a challenge to follow up on such a powerful presentation. I would say we have something in common. That is to say that we are both of us former commission officials, you would say bureaucrats. But I did not have the privilege to serve my country as a minister, which means that I might have missed something in my career. I would, as you did, start my presentation by going back to the roots. It was said yesterday that the EU was totally unequipped to play the game of power politics because it was born out of war to build peace. So when I'm going to the roots of the EU when dealing with the socio-economic paradigm, I find these roots deeply planted in the economic world. It's, you know, kind of a Russian puppet game. It's the the European coal and steel community, then it's the custom union, then it's the internal market, and it ends up provisionally, maybe, with the economic and monetary union. It was at the time of the Delors Commission that there was a feeling, more than a feeling, that there was a deeply rooted political conviction that achieving internal market had to be complemented by so-called flanking policies, which would secure a fair redistribution of the single market. That is the moment where the logo or the slogan, call it whatever you want, of the social market economy was promoted. It's still there. You can still find it in the conclusions of the European Council nowadays, in view of implementing the so-called model of reins capitalism. However, still today, we see a profound imbalance between the EU economic core business and all other more or less related policies. When it comes to the core business, you have strong and clear legal basis. You have very streamlined decision-making process. You have leverage, budgetary leverage, financial leverage. We don't find that when it comes to flanking policies, where on the contrary, we have no legal basis or very weak legal basis, limited leverage of institutions, and where at the end of the day, the center of the gravity remains with member states. I would take one example, which I know a little bit better because I was once in charge of these policy areas: employment policies. Employment policies are strictly national competences. They are member states' prerogatives. the EU has a limited coordinating role when it comes to employment policies, which I'm not an economist by training, but I hear from my colleagues who are experts in macroeconomic that it creates a fundamental and structural imbalances between, on one end, an internal market for capital, goods, services, and individuals, and on the other end, national labor markets, which means that when it comes to competitiveness advantage, member states have as only leverage, mostly those participating into the European monetary union, to work on labor market conditions to indeed still compete with the other member states. I could also refer to many other policies. You remember, for instance, the illusion that we are at all about the development of a common health policy following the COVID, which led absolutely nowhere. The one and only initiatives that were taken have to do with emergency providing of medicines in kind of new pandemic outbreak. I could also refer to education. And by the way, the topic today is not about the achievement or the completion of the internal market. We still have to bear in mind that some fundamentals of this internal market are still not within the hands of the union. I mean, taxation has to be decided by unanimity. I think that it is indeed where the fight against for QMV has to be fought. And when we come to energy policy, it's clearly stated that the energy mix remains a national competence, which creates problem for the future ideas of having something like an EU energy grid. So since then, I know that we were expected to look at, I mean, the benefits or the pros and cons of the development of a socio-economic paradigm during the last 15 years. But as time passes quickly, I will zoom out and come immediately to now where we are today. There were, by the way, ups and downs in the history. I mean, there has been the development of a so-called European pillar of social rights. The last presidency, which invested bravely in the reinforcement of this European pillar of social rights, was the Portuguese presidency. Since then, it has been there. The Commission has announced an initiative aiming at revamping that European pillar of social rights. We shall see. There were also, by the way, to be completed, significant failure about the development of these policy tools with regard to the development of policy tools. I mean, the European social dialogue is a fig leaf. I mean, it did not deliver on anything. And there were two institutions created, but they are not even institutions. There were two bodies created at the time, the European Economic and Social Committee and the Committee of the European Region, which are still there. That's their only purpose. They are still there, and they have no influence whatsoever on the decision-making process. Now, coming back to the present time, and that could indeed open the discussion about the priorities on the reopen the discussion about the priorities of the the incoming Cypriot presidency. Well, you know that at the beginning of the legislature, I mean, the European Council, the heads of states and government, I have the feeling that I'm lecturing a well-documented audience, are adopting a document called the Strategic Agenda. I will quote the Strategic Agenda, and I will gain bonus point with Jim Close. So, I mean, when you look at the Strategic Agenda, they indeed, I mean, the heads of states and government of the 27 member states are affirming their determination to build, I quote, a prosperous and competitive Europe. And in particular, they write, we are determined to strengthen the basis of our long-term competitiveness and improve our citizens' economic and social well-being. We will work to increase their purchasing power, create good jobs and services in Europe. They want to make a success of the Green Deal and digital transition. They want to pursue just and fair climate transition with the aim of staying competitive globally and increasing your energy sovereignty. And they insist on the fact that this should be done together. Economic growth needs to benefit all citizens. We will uphold the social dimension of the European dimension so that everyone can seize the opportunities offered by the green and digital transition. I quote the European Council, i.e. the heads of states and government of the 27 member states. This is reflected in a way in the political guidelines, which were presented by the then designated President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, in July July 2024, yes, the year before last, no, last year, there was a bit of an emotion or a commotion amongst others in the European Parliament when she first disclosed what her agenda would be, because there was a fear that the social dimension would be completely absent of that agenda. I mean, she had proposed a very ambitious plan for a new prosperity for Europe, built on 6 pillars. But yes, indeed, the social dimension was reintroduced at the end of her guidelines, where she proposed, or she insisted on the need to, I quote again, strengthen our societies and social models. I mean, it was very interesting that she resuscitated a concept which was, I mean, part of a joke when the first commission, von der Leyen Commission, was appointed, that's the concept of a European way of life. She is still about defending the European way of life. Some of you might remember this running joke about the portfolio of the then Vice President Chinas of the Commission, which was about either defending or promoting the European way of life. But that notion of promoting the way of life is still present in the guidelines of the Commission von der Leyen, 2 new action plan on implementation of the European pillar of social rights, and she announced a series of measures, and I will come back in a moment on some of them. Then comes the State of the Union speech of this year. I would like to pause 1 second about the way the State of the Union speech was elaborated. It was, I mean, heavily criticized by many observers in Brussels because it was seen as not a vision, a grand vision that the EU was needed, but an exercise of political balance between different fractions opposed within the European Parliament to make sure that she was keeping her political support firm for the next Commission. I don't mind about that at all. This is democracy in the making. I mean, she used to say that she wanted to have a geopolitical commission. She has a highly political commission, but that is democracy in the making. I mean, to see that the president of the commission is forced to circummaneuver to keep the support of the European Parliament is, at least in my own assessment, modest assessment, a progress in terms of democratic control on the institution. So indeed, one can see that she is circumnavigating, and it is indeed at the end of her State of the Union speech that she announces a series of new initiatives concerning, in particular, poverty and cost of living. Now, indeed, and I'm about to conclude, I mean, we can find, and that's the menu of the Cypriot presidency, welcome. When you look at the Commission work program, you can see a certain number of social-related initiatives which are to be presented by the Commission in the first semester of next year, during the Cypriot presidency. You have an intergenerational fairness strategy. I will come back on that in a second. You have an anti-poverty strategy. You are a strengthening of childcare guarantees and updated gender equality and rights of disabled person strategy, which are to be presented. All that is good and well, but I would pay more attention to, and that's my final set of comments, if you allow me, Madam Chair, to the 2 Bibles of the Commission or the Union nowadays, which are the famous or infamous Draghi and Letta report. What I find very interesting is that in these 2 reports, the 2 authors, although they focus on essentially the economic leg of the socio-economic model, do acknowledge that this will not be implemented if the Union is not taking care of not what are flanking measures, but structural development of the EU. One of them, for instance, which goes usually under the radar screen, is the demographic transition. I mean, we are all living in aging and shrinking population. And at the end of the day, you have Enrico Letta, who has to acknowledge that achieving the internal market would be useless if there is nobody to buy the goods and if there is nobody to produce the goods. So, I mean, we are facing a fundamental democratic transition, and there the EU is toothless. I mean, a lot of things have been done by the previous Commission under the auspices of Vice President Suica. And okay, I mean, the last thing that the Commission was able to deliver is the so-called toolbox, that is to say, a paper listing a series of instruments which are available to member states if they want to cater for the demographic evolution of their population. It's not forecast, it is going to happen. Babies who are not born today are adults who are not going to be there 20 years from now. That's an example. Hence, indeed, I think it's a good instinct, the idea to move to an intergenerational fairness strategy, because it's going to be a problem of possible competition between generations if they are not properly managed. Look at what's happening to the next generation EU instrument. It is implemented in a chaotic way, I agree, but what is discovered now is that actually the reimbursement of the interest rate will be much heavier than it was indeed foreseen. That means that indeed the money which has been spent today will have to be repaid by the future generation. So focusing on intergenerational fairness is not necessarily a bad idea, and I could also quote the skills agenda, where indeed a lot has to be done with very little instrument available at EU level if at the end member states are not getting their act together. So where does that lead me to? Is that what we are again confronted with when it comes to the social leg of the social economic paradigm is the structural problem that the EU has always had to manage expectations on one end and deliver on the other end. It's all good, and I will take one last example, and it's housing. And I will again refer to the example of the Cypriot taxi driver. I was in the same taxi as Paul yesterday evening. We had a 30 seconds conversation with this taxi driver, which we stopped immediately when he told us that the EU was only bad thing for Cyprus. So there is indeed, for the first time ever, one paragraph in the European Council conclusion about housing. I cannot resist, it's a short text, Madam Chair, to quote that paragraph. The European Council calls on the Commission to swiftly present an ambitious and comprehensive plan for affordable housing, the aim of which should be to support and complement Member States' efforts, including in the context of the simplification agenda, having due regard for the principle of subsidiarity and national competences. Okay, so this is one of these wonderful European Council ChatGPT drafted paragraph. And I was wondering, okay, if the taxi driver has asked me, what can the EU do to help me to find the cheap apartment that I would like to find in beautiful Nicosia? I wonder if I had quoted that paragraph, it would have the slightest impact of his belief that the EU is not bringing good things to Cyprus. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor de Brouwer. That was very insightful and very detailed, and we very much appreciate your analysis. Thank you. Now I will give the floor to Mr. Charis Polycarpou for his remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak to this event, and I'm glad that I must say that the panel, the speakers, the esteemed speakers, are selected very with good thought, because you can see from my intervention that all of us we face the same problems, but we have different angles and different positions. You might hear things that Mr. Petrides, Mr. de Brouwer notice, that they acknowledge, but our analysis and our way of thought are different and on a different angle. So I would try to answer also the question posed: what's the socioeconomic paradigm for Europe? And maybe my intervention would not be so optimistic, but it's coming out of reality and true agony for the future of the European Union. So, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, we stand at the crossroads, not just of policy, but of principle. And the question before us, what socioeconomic paradigm for Europe, demands an answer that goes beyond technical adjustments, beyond the discussion of the competence or the a question of whether we regulate or not enough. It demands courage to admit, first of all, our failures and a brave vision to build a future based on principles such as solidarity, prosperity, safety, and peace. For decades, the Union has been guided by a paradigm that prioritized deregulation, austerity, privatization as the guiding principles of economic growth and prosperity, and even expanded to other fields of policymaking in horizontal manner. The evidence of this orientation is now, I think, undeniable. The paradigm left the EU stagnant, lagging behind United States and China, and this is something that is acknowledged from all speakers. That's not a political assessment, that's a main argument highlighted even in the report presented by one of the most prominent figures of the European project, Mario Draghi, who currently took the responsibility to present measures for the future of the European Union and the economic policy of the European Union. So, in my view, the European Union failed to secure the future, failed to incorporate the social aspect, the aspect of people into the European project. So the question of this panel is very well phrased. We need to consider not just the economic paradigm of Europe, but we need to consider the people as a core value into this discussion. Today, I will outline three fractures of the current model, and I will try to course towards a different paradigm, one of solidarity and democratic control. So the first fracture, in my view, is the undermining of the common good principle, a union that is driven in many cases by national and in other cases of non-state actors' interests. The European project was conceived as an answer to nationalism, a promise that our common interest would create a shared destiny. Yet we have built an architecture that in many cases actively undermines this premise. The EU today functions as a structure oriented to even out or to balance national interests, where the largest member states of the European Union set the agenda. This may sound unavoidable in today's world, but it surely fuels internal divisions between North and South, on the nexus, for instance, of austerity versus debt, or between West and East, under the nexus of rule of law or the democratic backsliding. Even worse, it fuels populism and far-right extremism powered by discontent over inequality and migration. Without solidarity in its core, the European Union, unfortunately, is turning into a dark path. We saw this in the case of Cyprus during the long decade of austerity following the financial crisis of 2008, dogmatic enforcement of fiscal rules, strangled public investment, forced the fire sale of public assets across the north of the European Union, and plunged Southern Europe into a depression from which it has still not fully recovered. This was not an economic necessity, in my view. It was a political choice to discipline populations and dismantle social protection under the belief that we do not need to lift moral hazard to European populations. We need to pass the message that any European population that considers to go away from the European rules should be punished in a way that no other could consider to do so. Second fracture is the competitive gap. EU went from becoming, it was mentioned before, the most competitive economy in the world, as stated in the Lisbon strategy, to a position today where the target now is to narrow the gap with the United States and China. Very commonly is written in media, Europe has become a declining power, increasingly lagging behind the United States and now overtaken by China. I don't know if this is an exaggeration, but this phrase has a true meaning in its core. On one hand, Germany, as the strongest economic power in the European Union, continues to rank third in the global economy, even ahead of Japan. France, Italy, and Spain continue to be global economic powers and have been able to maintain their positions there. But on the other hand, if you see European Union as a whole, as a union, there is a devastating position: our declining global competitiveness. We can no longer ignore the gap that separates us on economic and technological terms with the United States and China. The recent Draghi report offers a stark assessment of this reality, and it tells us that Europe is falling behind in critical sectors like artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and clean technology. Our capital markets are disconnected, our innovation ecosystem is fragmented, and our regulatory framework diminishes motivation. So it's time to dismiss the myth that Europe is narrowing the gap, because the data is stark and undeniable. In the critical race of artificial intelligence, the United States created 40 major models last year, China created 15, and European Union only 3. Our energy prices are a massive competitive handicap, with our gas prices 4 times higher than in the US. Draghi himself warns that Europe is losing ground on the European growth model, and vulnerabilities are multiplying in the European Union. So, confronted with this diagnosis, what has been our response? Instead of going to a bold collective leap forward, we have, in my view, accepted a blackmail, and we have step by step diminished our global presence. The recent one-sided agreement without democratic legitimacy and mandate with the Trump administration is the proof of this problematic vision. By accepting the deal, we are not closing the competitive gap. We are institutionalizing it. We are signaling to the world that Europe lacks the confidence and the cohesion to stand on its own feet and make decisions that serve first and foremost the interest of the people. Third fracture, I believe that it's the social crisis, and it's where the failure hits our home. This is not just a crisis, but it's an inability to link the economic growth with the interest of the people. First of all, it's the energy poverty crisis. Our reliance on a market-driven growth of energy sector has left us vulnerable to price shocks, with energy giants profiting while families are not able to cover their energy needs. We need to work on safeguarding affordable power to all, forming a strategy on national and European level based on public interest. Also, energy security provides a telling case study. Europe rushed decoupling from Russian energy supplies, but has created an unprecedented demand for American LNG exports. Where the US exported no LNG to Europe in 2015, by 2025 it had become the continent's primary supplier. So this dramatic shift has not only economically but profoundly geopolitical implications, and has created soaring energy prices in the Union. The second crisis is about housing. Housing is a fundamental human right and has been transformed into a speculative global asset. The result is a missed generation, while the EU budget offers no EU-wide solution to this emergency. And to elaborate to the conversation with the taxi driver, It's not a matter of what you put on the strategy, it's a matter of the result that comes out of this strategy. If there is no money, if there is no prospect, or if there is no specific measures built on this strategy, then on the principle level, intentions may be well, but the result is weak. And third is the rising inequality. This is a central failure in my view. Economic justice cannot be built on the backs of the societies, while the 1% population accumulates obscene levels of wealth. We have moved backwards because we face stagnated wages, while wealth accumulation soars, eroding social trust and democratic itself. What was the European Commission response to this emergency? You can see the proposed multi-annual financial framework for 2028-2034, which is completely, it has a negative outcome when it comes on its priorities. It's a budget that chooses to increase spending on military while it diminishes spending on social care. It includes a tenfold explosion of military spending from 12 billion to 130 to 130 billion euros, while the funding on social cohesion, on European Social Fund, on agriculture are significantly decreased. The share of budget for Europe's social model and quality of life went from 65% to 45%. So these are not separate issues. They are interconnected symptoms of an economic model that has privileged efficiency over resilience, that has privileged markets over people, and austerity over investment. A union that cannot keep the lights on affordability, that cannot house its people, that cannot manage a fair transition on climate, that allows its social fabric to tear, it's a union that has lost its way. So, what's the alternative? Our alternative is not a minor adjustment, it's not a technical adjustment. It's a different paradigm built on the principles of solidarity, of democracy, and on the principle of putting first our human needs. A democratic and green industrial policy which can safeguard specific elements of our economy. This means that we need to put a moratorium on the closure of strategic industrial sites. It means creating energy companies under public control across Europe to invest in renewable, to reduce prices, and to create alternatives that foster economic growth. It means investing in innovation. It means that we need to have a green transition, but that is not paid from the people, but it's funded from EU budget that is well organized and well driven. Also, we need a budget for the many. The money, in my view, is there because it's time to stop pretending that there is no money. The money have been stolen, hidden, and attacked to give credit to ultra-high net worth individuals. Let us use these resources to double the European Social Fund, to launch a European program for public housing, and to fund a just transition that guarantees healthcare and education for all. And also, we need a foreign policy of peace and cooperation. Our new paradigm extends beyond our borders. We need to see how we use our diplomacy to end the war in Ukraine, recognizing that an arms race only deepens the suffering and burden on people and on our economies. In conclusion, the choice is no longer between the current decline and a militarized fortress. We need to choose a Europe that is collective in its strength, sovereign in its decision, social in its purpose, and has a green vision. We need to build a paradigm worthy of its people, of peace, trust, and democratic control. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Polycarpou, for your analysis and insights. Very, very helpful indeed. Let me ask you one question, and it would be the same question to all of you based on the analysis from your perspective. What would be the most important issue that the European Union would probably need to handle at the moment from your perspective? And hopefully will be different issues. Mr. Petrides?
I think I can answer that question.
There's too many.
If you are talking about the specific subject, yeah, I would probably say the migration issue. But if you are talking in general, I would say governance.
Mhm.
And I did mention before in my introduction about the governance problems of an over-centralized bureaucracy. I'm not just talking about the Commission. The Commission that has 33 directorate generals and more services, and every year they become more and more and more and more. The decision-making process, it's a labyrinth. And away from the people. The people are not aware of what is happening, and about 70% of our legislation comes from the European Union. So the European Union it's also a scapegoat in the eyes of the national governments. Well, it came from Europe, Blame Europe for everything. But you are there, what you are doing? Well, I cannot do anything because it's qualified majority. Or because there are no minutes. Or because there are no transparent decisions in the Council of Ministers, or there are no transparent decisions in the European Council. So this governance issue cannot go any longer. So it has to be simplified and be put down to simplicity and focus, as I said before, a phrase, govern less, govern better.
Thank you. I think you have answered the question very well. Thank you for that. And Dr. De Brouwer.
Okay, I would give two answers to your question. That's to say, two issues that could be tackled at relatively short term. The first one, I did not mention that, I didn't have time. When you look at the EU language, I mean, everybody is now convinced that we need a fair green transition. But very few is said and done when it comes to a fair digital transition. And I think that there, I mean, well, not necessarily at EU level, but certainly also in a coordinated way at national level. Okay, everybody now is advocating about innovation, and of course, everybody is advocating, discussing about the challenges around AI, the famous two letters. But nobody is actually focusing on what does that mean for, I mean, the social fabric of our societies. What does that mean in terms of generation gap? What does that mean in terms of employment? I mean, this ongoing debate, is AI detrimental or not to employment? What does that mean in terms of education and skills? This goes completely under the radar screen, and I think that more attention should be paid to that. The second issue is indeed the one of governance. And there, I think there is a huge challenge ahead of the Cypriot presidency, and that's a discussion about the MFF. Let me just explain that in a while. Okay, we come from a situation, I mean, the existing cohesion policy, when it comes to how to make use of EU money, the approach of member states is to quote an old movie of Woody Allen, take the money and run. I take my money, I do whatever I want with it at national level, and please give me a break. Give me a break. The one and only control that the Commission is able to implement is a regularity control, the famous error rates, which turns many European bureaucrats completely paranoid. But for God's sake, this is European taxpayers' money. This is not the member states' money. And the EU spending must serve EU purposes at national level, but must serve. So now the answer of the Commission in its proposal for the next MFF to that might go in the other direction. That is to say, I would agree with you, and I think that member states are already on the barricades, that when it comes to the structure and the implementation of the new MFF, there is indeed a power grasp by the Commission, whether it is for the internal budget or the external budget. And I think that the Commission will hardly survive that. I mean, that will be, for me, together with the amount dedicated to that, one of the most difficult discussions that will take place place under Cypriot presidency. Then we have to find the right balance between the two. I don't have the silver bullet myself, but I mean, the agreement that will have to be found will have somewhere to be somewhere in between. These are, I think, two relatively short-term challenges, which are for us ahead of us next year, which are palatable, contrary to many of the issues that we've been discussing during these 2 days in Cyprus, and where indeed the Cypriot presidency could leave a trace.
Thank you.
Marina, can I just add something very quickly? Because sometimes you talk about, I mean, theoretically, and I did, yeah? And I did talk about regulation killing innovation. I will give a very specific example that I live now through my hat in the private sector. Crypto. Okay? Innovation could offer solutions to the economy, to the people. The crypto industry in Europe is being destroyed. All of the companies are leaving because of the new MiCA regulation. With that new MiCA regulation, it's like Europe saying, we don't want this, go away. And they're running away to Australia, to Canada, to the US and other jurisdictions. So there are many, many examples. Innovation is not if you give a few €100,000 to startups that 95% of them will fail and just waste public money, because this is what is happening. So,
Thank you, Mr. Petrides. Thank you, Mr. Brouwer. That was wonderful. Mr. Polycarpou.
Yes, I think that the EU now is in front of an existential question to answer. I think that EU should answer whether they want to be, if they want to be an actor of cooperation in the area, or an actor that fuels confrontation. And I mean, we've seen what's going on in the geopolitical level. We see how the war in Ukraine has developed over the last couple of years. We see the rise of tension in Middle East, but we see a European Union that, for the time being, tries to find steps and how to move forward. And I think that the discussion about the multi-annual financial framework, whether we would increase the spending on external, on spending on military and on war economy, or whether we will increase our internal, the spending on our internal needs, shows exactly this existential question and dilemma. I think that for the time being, European Union, if they want to increase the living standard of its people, should find a coherent answer to how the energy sector and the cost of production can be reduced in order to be competitive. And by increasing the spending on war economy, I think that would be a detriment against this target. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Polycarpou. That was very insightful. Thank you. Do we have time to get some questions? I think we will have time for one.
4 questions.
I know. The lady in blue. She was first.
My question is, when you talk about socioeconomic analysis and prognosis, do you consider that Russia has changed its economy totally to the military basis? So now they cannot switch without this economy collapsing. I mean, switch to the peaceful economy. Yes, they build factories that produce weapons. They give people workplaces on those factories. So the economy will collapse without war. And you are telling that Europe should switch on peaceful economy. So how do you consider it being a neighbor to Russia?
To whom do you direct this question, or to anybody?
Firstly, probably to Mr.
Polycarpou.
and maybe others.
Okay.
So it's a fact that when European Union managed to have a cooperation with Russia and importing gas from Russia, Germany, its biggest economy, had a very competitive economy and have very high growth figures. At the moment, Germany, which is the main economy of the European Union, faces a stagnated economic era, an era where high energy prices are diminishing its industrial capacity. So this cannot be considered as something that goes on the sideline, and this has effects to other European countries. So if our policy is not a policy through diplomacy which can achieve, I don't say that tomorrow or in 2-3 weeks, but over time, it's not a policy that achieves at least a side-by-side a policy that is, let's say, both European Union and Russia have a cooperative stance, then this means that most of the economies in the European Union will have a difficulty to see and have economic prospect. I think that the diplomatic terms can help to achieve this goal. Otherwise, if we continue to be on the present situation, this would be a detriment. This would have a detrimental impact on the economy and the societies of the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. Polycarpou. Would you, Dr. De Brouwer and Mr. Petrides? No? Great. I think we're going to wrap this up because we're running out of time. People are smiling to me. Thank you all very much for your participation. Please feel free to catch up with the esteemed speakers while they're going out for your personal questions. And thank you for your participation.